with all this devastation around them, I want to create at least, one proper room for the little kids that is just got a really soft plushy carpet and toys and books, and somewhere that just is safe and normal and warm and comforting, where they don't have to look at bombed out buildings.
Elizabeth from British Expeditionary Agent Rescue, welcome to Robinson College digitally. You're coming to us live from, can you say the region where you're working at the moment?
The southern region.
Southern, okay. Can I ask what led you there? Why did you decide to leave a pretty comfortable post in the UK to go and do the kind of work that you're doing now?
Well, first I'll say it was never the plan to be out here this long. Never in a million years did I think I would be here this much later. No, at the time I had just returned from a sabbatical traveling. I'd been in the Middle East. I returned from Saudi Arabia on the 21st of February, and I was just thinking about what to do next. And I remember very clearly waking up the morning it had happened and seeing this footage of tanks rolling across the border. And I just thought, no, this history cannot be repeating itself. It looks exactly like World War II. And although I am completely British, one of my grandmothers was a Polish refugee, and she had to flee the Nazi advance. And honestly, in that moment, in some ways, I felt very Polish, because it felt like a lot of British people around me were slightly ambivalent.
Yeah.
They cared. They did care. I'm not saying people didn't care. They absolutely did. And of course, there's a huge upswelling of support. But there wasn't maybe perhaps quite the same level of understanding, because the UK has never been occupied. It's incredibly cliche to say it, but if not me, then who? I'm young, I'm able-bodied, I don't have dependents. I had already rented out my flat. My dog was staying with my parents. My life was in storage. I was able to go, and I felt very strongly that I should.
That's quite a powerful phrase from an ancient Jewish philosopher that is widely quoted, but very rarely legitimately employed, I think. If not me, who? If not now, when? And I think we communicated. I think I sent you this. The third element that doesn't get quoted is, if only for me, what am I? That bit doesn't get added to the self-help kind of guru quotations of that line. But you've got some experience of people pitching up and only thinking about their social media accounts and so on.
Yes, sadly.
Maybe we'll come on to that. I may be jumping ahead a little bit. Can I ask you a little bit about how, when you arrived there, what you were doing when you first arrived, and how it was different to what you expected?
I didn't know what to expect, and nobody did. The thing that bothered me was the cold. All those images of all of those women and children standing at the border in the snow, hypothermia, it was grim. So I loaded up my little Peugeot hatchback, not the most conflict zone friendly car, with sleeping bags. I did a fundraiser.
The right-hand drive.
Yes. And it was really dangerous driving out there because of the sleeping bags, because they were full right up behind my head. I had cardboard behind the two seats to load it as full as possible, because it was a small car. So every time I merged onto a motorway, I couldn't see. So I was just praying I wouldn't be mown down by a lorry. But anyway, I'm sure my family will be thrilled to hear that bit. And I had found a contact through some Facebook groups of someone to take these sleeping bags to. And so my plan, I told everyone when I was leaving that I was only planning to go to the Polish-Ukraine border, because emotions were very high. I didn't have the time. I left the UK within a week. So organizing everything, the fundraise, getting everything keyed up, buying all my kit, getting my car seen to by a garage. It happened very fast. I didn't have any time to field everyone's reactions. And also, we didn't know if the Russians were going to push through. Everything was
At
up in
that
the air.
stage, for sure, yeah.
Exactly. But my plan was to go into Ukraine to deliver these sleeping bags. And that was, in terms of to your question about what you expect, I've been asked quite a few times, what is the scariest moment you've experienced in Ukraine? And that I can't really answer because
Sure.
difficult things have happened. We have been shelled. We have almost died on one occasion. But you don't feel fear when that's happening. As anyone who spent time in a conflict zone will know. But the time that took the most courage was driving across that border because I was
Yeah.
utterly alone. And I was driving down the motorway from Poland. I see every other car peeling off that motorway to stay inside Poland. I'm the only car driving to Ukraine on that road.
Goosebumps. That,
I was scared. I was scared because I had no idea what was on the other side of that border. And you think that as soon as you cross that border, you are stepping into a full conflict zone. You are going to have bombings. You are going to have planes. And of course, actually, that's not true.
yeah,
So
yeah,
I drove into Lviv. They put these sleeping bags. Lviv railway station, they had created rooms for women and children to sleep in, people to stay. They were all waiting for trains. The trains were horribly full. It was absolute chaos. I delivered the sleeping bags to Lviv railway station there because there were lots of people, and especially women and children, sheltering there, waiting for trains that were
yeah.
so full. And I had prearranged to evacuate some women and children out. So I met two women and their two little daughters and one of their husbands. That was definitely a difficult moment because I suddenly realized that he had traveled with his family across Ukraine to make sure they safely reached me. And then he was having to say goodbye to them right
And
then because he couldn't leave. He
right
was
there in
about
front
of
of
parenting
you.
age. So I suddenly realized that he was putting his little 5-year-old girl into the back seat of my car and kissing her with no idea if he was going to see her again.
And that's not what
Um,
you expected your
so that was
anti Peugeot to end up doing.
no, no. Persia did really well. We had to drive through the snow that night, and she didn't have winter tires. In fact, some of the tires were quite worn down. I didn't know anything about cars really then, and I know a little bit more now. Um, but you know, 5 people and very heavily laden, and she got through the snow that night. She got those people out. So she's a great little car.
And did you
But no,
drive them all the way back to UK?
I took them to Warsaw. So one of them,
Okay,
she was going to be working remotely from Warsaw, and actually all 4 of them had decided to stay together. 2 of them later on, about 6 months later, did relocate to the UK, but not with me.
right. Okay.
But you know, to your question about what did I expect? I never expected any of this. I thought maybe I'd do a couple of weeks of driving women and kids out from Lviv across the border into Poland. You know, I had Polish cousins there. I could help find them places to stay. But then I met my co-founder Johnny and a couple of other Brits, and we ended up forming a team, and we started doing aid runs into Kiev area, in particular into Bucha and Irpin,
Okay. Okay.
as soon as it was liberated, which was very intense. And this is when the main road between Lviv and Kiev, the E40, was still the front line close to Kiev. So we were having to do a 14-hour one-way trip each way to cut south via Oman, to then cut up. And you don't know anything then. You're trying to source intelligence, you know, what's going on, which places are getting hit, what's going on. We had an ex-Marine in our team at that point. He was brilliant, very humble, totally acknowledged that a lot of his knowledge from Afghanistan was not relevant in Ukraine.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
He helped us in every way that he could with what he knew. But, you know, we had a long discussion about if shelling came in, should we jump out the vehicle and take shelter on the ground in a ditch, or should we stay in the vehicle? His experience would say, get down low into a ditch, because in Afghanistan, things would explode upwards. So you
Yeah.
want to be low, Whereas in Ukraine, it's not like that. If shelling comes in, you're just you just want to be behind shelter, but being below it is not the defining factor. And for us, actually, we have the decision that if shelling comes in, it's get in the vehicle and get out in case, depending on the area we're working in. But for most of when we're in back commute, for example, it would be in case there was a double tap. So
Okay.
getting into
Yeah, yeah. Oh, can you just explain what a double tap is to people that
oh, it's
don't know?
it's it's a lovely tactic
Yeah,
that the Russians do love to use, which is when a place is hit, and then there is a delay while medics, responders, helpers, anyone, family members get to the scene to help the people who've been injured, and then they hit it again.
because you've got a much bigger target then.
Yes, and it's psychological warfare as well. You know, you go to help people and you might get hit, and actually we had to make a hard decision about that once. It's when I'm fast forwarding slightly, but
Fine. No.
when we had moved to the Donbass and we were eating pizza in Kramatorsk one day, and there's a hit around the corner, which didn't happen often. And we went out to check that the van was all right. We thought maybe the windows would have been blown out. She was fine. And then we thought, well, what do we do? Should we go and help? We didn't have medical training at that point. You know, we know how to put on a tourniquet. We know how to, shove on an Israeli, but we have since had some trauma training, but we certainly hadn't at that point. So we thought, are we just going to be in the way? Are we going to be a liability? Especially being foreigners, people are going to, it shouldn't be the case, but it is. If a foreigner gets hurt rather than a local, it creates even more problems for the Ukrainians. And we have to respect that and
Sure.
be aware. So in the end, we sort of came to the decision to park the van slightly away from the place that had been hit in case there was a double tap, and for us to go and scout if there's anyone we could immediately help, chuck them on a soft stretcher, get them in the back of the van and get them to the hospital, because we knew all the hospitals very well. And there wasn't. So we left and just kept out of the way. But those are sorts of decisions you have to make.
Yeah, of course, which go against your natural instinct and your reason for being there in some ways. But presumably, though, you still had the chap who's a Royal Marine with you, so you had some sense of security drills.
Again, credit to his humility. It was maybe about a couple of weeks in, at most a month, where he said, "There's nothing more I can really tell you. You guys will know more than I will now."
Yeah.
So I'm always here if you want to chat to me about situations, but there's not a lot I can add now.
Yeah.
What we would chat through was developing our drills, or SOPs, as you would call them if you were proper military, which of course
Standard operating procedures. Yeah.
yes. And that was something that we developed as a team. Ukraine, there are huge areas of Ukraine that are safe. And again,
this is one of the things. Yeah, this would be nice to draw out. So people will assume that if you go to Przemysl and drive across the border, you're in a war zone, which officially you are, and you could be blown up at any moment.
Yeah, it's not.
There are multiple lines between there and where the real dangers are.
Yes. So essentially, you've got it's the largest country in Europe. The sort of visual, and of course, everyone will see images of shelling and burning and fires on the news, of course, because that is what's happening. And it is awful what is happening. But it is not happening in every village and every town in such a large country.
Yeah.
So when you cross that border, you have a large country. You have yes, the whole country is within missile range. So yes, the Russians will do strikes on Lviv, on Kiev, on Kharkiv, on Dnipro, on Kherson, on Mykolaiv, etc., etc. Yes, also drones. Obviously, the risk of drones has gone up massively.
Sure.
A drone is not going to target a civilian building that you're staying in. The greater risk would actually be if it was shot down and some debris would fall. But again, this is 1,000,000 to 1 chance. Something that really struck me was the first time we ever went to Kiev, and the people that we were delivering aid to took us to the first building that was ever hit in Kiev when the invasion started. And in my head, we were going to Kiev and, practically every building was going to be blown apart and, just scenes of utter devastation. And there was just this one hit, and yes, it had ripped several rooms out of that building. It was a big multi sort of apartment block building.
Mhm.
No one had been killed. A couple of people had been injured, but the scale of devastation to what I had in my mind when I first entered the country was wildly different. So if you are in areas close to the front lines, then that's different. So then you've got questions of, well, are you in artillery range? Are you in a place that's very visible? So if they have, if you're, for instance, handing out humanitarian aid, you do not want to be gathering a large amount of people together in a place where the Russians can see you, either by drone or, God forbid, if you're really close to the river or something. I mean, even a sniper could see you. I mean, that would be madness. But there are huge amounts of beautiful, beautiful, beautiful countryside and dachas and rivers where there's a huge culture of swimming in Ukraine because there's so much water. It's beautiful. When we lived in our van for 3 months last year, I mean, yes, our friends did also have showers, but actually we'd start off every day by going for a swim in the river in the morning. It was stunning. These are the things that people don't think about. There's still so much beauty in Ukraine.
Mm.
And it's not the case that as soon as you cross the border, everything is sort of being pillaged and burned.
But it's quite hard to, like, for instance, to cross the zero line. There'd be multiple barriers that would be between you and that. So to do that, it's not going to happen. To be in the place of real danger,
Yeah.
you'd have to work really hard to
So
get.
if you're talking in military terms of, as you all know, of course, you're talking about the line of contact. Even how people use the term the front line here varies massively because you might be talking within 1 kilometer, but technically it can be up to 15, 20 kilometers back from the line of contact, which is
Yeah.
very different. And the way that you operate within that area is very different. So I have spent plenty of time operating within what is technically front line. Does that mean I'm anywhere near hearing small arms fire, trenches, recce teams? No, absolutely. But this is where I understand that it's very hard for people who haven't been here to understand what these things actually mean,
I always say,
what
yeah,
it actually looks like. So, for example, when we started doing our first aid runs into Bucha and Irpin and that sort of area, and then we were asked by one of our Ukrainian friends we'd made to help him evacuate bedridden people and disabled people and elderly people from the Donbass. And it was a huge step for us. Even from that point, with all the fear, all of our families having kittens that were in Ukraine in the first place, we never even planned to go beyond Lviv. So suddenly we're in Kiev, and then suddenly we're being asked to go to the Donbass, and not just the Donbass, but Lysychansk, which probably people may well have forgotten the name, but Severodonetsk at that point had fallen to the Russians. Lysychansk was just on the side of the river. It's very, very close. That is frontline.
yeah, yeah.
So for us, hugely inexperienced, completely civilian. And I understand to some people, this might sound, well, you must be crazy. I'm sure that some people thought that, well, you must just be crazy. But when you are here and each step that you take, you realize actually this is not nearly as dangerous as you think it is. I'm not saying it isn't dangerous. You have to treat it with respect. But it's not the burning inferno of an entire country that people see, is all that people see on the news.
Yeah.
And you realize that you can do these situations. So when we went into Lysychansk, we're going into people's houses, we're laying elderly people on soft stretchers, we're carrying them out. And you realize that you can do it, which we did, and we took very seriously. So we ended up being in the Donbass for 4 months. And again, different expectations people have. When we went to the Donbass, because of this narrative that everyone in the West has been told, we thought, gosh, you know what? There's going to be a lot of pro-Russian people there. We may not be welcome. We may not even be safe. We might get a car bomb. We might get attacked. We might get our location fed to the Russians and get hit. No, we had no idea how good or not good this situation would be. And it is absolutely not true.
Yeah.
In the Donbass, The South is different, but I'll get back to that in a second. In the Donbass, in the West, people say, oh, the war started in 2020. The war did not start then. It started in 2014. For the Donbass, it certainly started in 2014. The people there are tired. All they want is to be able to have their children, have their grandchildren, have their house, have their little plot of land, grow some things, have a normal family life. If there is one way that I could describe anyone's political leaning there, it is utter, worn down apathy. They don't care anymore who is in power. They just want to be able to get on with their lives. And it's just become irrelevant because it's been going on for so long. We lived in Kramatorsk for months, but then we moved to Pokrovsk, which is when we were evacuating people, we would take them mainly from Bakhmut, Lysychansk, or Kramatorsk, and we would put them on the train at Pokrovsk. It started to get a little bit uncomfortable living in the van. There was a Ukrainian artillery position close by. The mosquitoes came out in force. So we finally gave up and got a flat in Pokrovsk. And it was the first time we'd ever had neighbors. And we thought, oh, okay, we need to be a little bit cognizant of this. There might be people who are pro-Russian, who are in our building, who now know where we live and where we are every single night.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If anyone had wanted to harm us, they would have had to mow all of our neighbors down. They adored us. They would drag us down to give us Sunday lunch for Miners' Day, which is a national holiday here. They dragged us outside. They would give us vodka. They would give us food. They would give us bags of food all the time. We'd bump into them in the stairs. Sometimes they just leave it outside our door. One of our neighbors, the one who was the friendliest, his wife was in Moscow. I'm fairly sure he was born in Russia. And he was the one who we had the best relationship with. So, and the other sort of real thing that I did not expect that we learned from being there is, again, and a lot of this is down to Russian propaganda, which is very long-standing and very successful, is this idea that Russian speakers are pro-Russia. It is not true, because to say, oh, well, someone is Russian speaking implies an element of choice. It implies that that person has the option of speaking both Ukrainian and Russian, and they have chosen to speak Russian.
Yeah.
And what people don't realize is that for decades and decades, Russia has been installing Russian-speaking schools. They put Russians into senior official positions in the cities, in any position of power. They made it such that if any Ukrainian wanted to have a good job, they had to speak Russian if they wanted to work in the city and get anywhere in life. And the Russians did a very heavy propaganda that Ukrainian is some kind of countryside hick language. They even tried to do propaganda that it's actually only a dialect of Russian. We know a lot of Ukrainian people now. We have a lot of friends here. It soon will be coming up in 2 years that we've been here. Every single one of our friends who is working for Ukraine, to help Ukraine, volunteering, every single one of them, Russian is their first language. It doesn't mean a thing that Ukrainian is not the first language. And what is really interesting now is seeing the next generation come through who do have the choice, because especially since 2014, every child is now educated in school in Ukrainian. They're also starting to be taught English. Of course, none of them were allowed to be taught English before. That's another thing. So suddenly you have the next generation come through who may still speak Russian at home. Yeah. A lot of them are growing up fully bilingual, but every single young person I've met, call it maybe mid-20s and younger, this whole next generation who've come through being educated in Ukrainian, every single one of them has chosen to stop speaking Russian and to speak Ukrainian.
Gosh.
So that choice is happening. But this idea that Russian speakers are it's incredibly blind to the broader history of what Russia has done and how Russia has pushed this. And we've seen this so many times. It's the same with Hitler trying to unite German-speaking peoples. Yeah. It's a very good excuse to say they are pro-Russia.
I suppose, and again, we even have to be careful, don't we, in talking about Russia, because presumably you're talking about Russian foreign policy decisions rather than all the individuals who are Russian. Um, it's a bit of an issue here in Cambridge, for instance, looking after Russian students when there's so much
Mm.
um, anti-Russian sentiment. Yeah, I mean, even that dimension, I guess, is tricky to discuss. And when you're talking
Yeah,
British, you have to use generalizations.
I mean, there are of course massive generalizations. You know, I absolutely know some Russian people who are based in the UK, not many, a few. Uh, they are all very against the war. Um, it's interesting recognizing what the impact of Russian propaganda is. I remember one of our friends in Kiev was saying his brother before the invasion, went to work in Russia briefly, as everyone did back then. Lots of people moving between Ukraine and Russia and working in different places. It was not a big deal. And his brother worked in Russia for a bit. And even though he was Ukrainian, pro-Ukraine, all of these things, he said that after 3 months of being there around the TV, around the radio, it was starting to bend his mind, and it freaked him out, and so he left. But this is happening now. I mean, I was watching a clip of some official Russian state TV the day before yesterday. So Russia Today, the sort of major channel, and what is terrifying, and I say this carefully because I'm aware that this is not a thought area that people really want to think about or go down. Russia is already laying the narrative for justifying invading other European countries that are part of NATO. And this clip was saying that the British are behind all of this. They are saying that the British intelligence agencies were responsible for pushing countries into World War I and World War II. They are saying that Britain is a dying old man who needs organ donors. They
That's
really push this
probably true.
narrative.
Yeah.
Well, they really push this narrative. For example, when we were evacuating the Donbass, some elderly people were scared of us because they would say, "Oh, well, you guys come to harvest organs. You're going to steal me away and harvest my organs."
Oh, hold on a minute. Sorry, I thought you meant that metaphorically. I didn't realize you meant literally.
No. Literally, we would have. Think about it. You'd have an elderly woman in her 80s who is not probably many years off death. Her organs are probably not going to be your transplant option. And this didn't happen often, but we did hear about it. They were scared because this is the propaganda that is fed through Russian TV.
Yeah.
He said every foreigner in Ukraine is a mercenary. So even if you're humanitarian, they would consider me a mercenary,
Yeah.
a paid soldier. And they were being told that British and Americans were harvesting organs from the Donbass. But this is the extent of the craziness of what these people are told. But this narrative that's being laid, and how I don't think people realize quite how extreme the Russian propaganda is. It is a narcissistic state. It is pure projection. In these types of interviews, and they will be saying, we are cultured and we talk about things carefully, and we are very responsible, and Britain it infiltrates everything and influences everything, but works very hard not to leave its fingerprints on there. It's talking about the UK exactly as what Russia does.
Gosh. Well, can I move you on? Because I realize we haven't discussed what you're actually doing. It probably sounds so far like your role there is to go from one danger zone to another,
No,
and
really,
experience mishap after mishap. But presumably, the day job is much more routine. You'll be settled into form of daily habits now, presumably long hours, slow grind of work where you have to be careful and so on. Can you say a bit about the work that you're actually doing,
Yes.
the benefit that you're bringing to the people that you work with?
Yeah, well, so evacuations died down. We were doing evacuations sort of really consistently through 2022. And we popped back to the UK for Christmas for the first time, which was lovely. And by the time we came back, Bakhmut had fallen, or was certainly about to fall. So we diversified. So we spent a lot of 2023, again, to your point earlier, things I never would have expected, working on drinking water. If you told me even 6 months before you do things in drinking water, I'd think you were crazy. But we started to realize that, the Russians were using water towers for target practice. They were poisoned wells by dropping, when they were withdrawing from a village, if they were being pushed out, they would put dead dogs down the wells. They would put their own Russian dead soldiers down the wells to
That's,
poison the water supply. So these people there were 11 villages sort of in the area that didn't have any water. So we started installing barrels, we started delivering water. And then in early June, the Novokakhovka Dam was hit and the flooding happened, which everybody saw. But again, expectations. Everyone thought there would be a huge need for evacuations. We did as well. We actually kitted up, and the day of it, we were ready to do evacuations. And they didn't need it at all because it wasn't a tidal wave. People walking calmly, getting into their cars or on a bus laid on by the local administration. There weren't huge IDP centres. There weren't huge amounts of displaced people. It was actually quite gradual. And we suddenly realized that actually the crisis was drinking water. And we were, purely by fluke, we were the only team in this southern area, so around Kherson and that whole area, who were already doing water. And it was completely overwhelming. I can honestly say I've never been under so much pressure in my life. We pulled in new teammates. We had a couple of brilliant British people jump in, and a German guy, and we just worked around the clock, really, for 3 months. Like, I mean, I think maybe we had 2 days off in 3 months, because everyone's water had just gone.
yeah, yeah,
And the response from the large charities was not sufficient or timely
yeah.
or security safe. What we were saying earlier about congregating people, they would send in a large water bowser and have people dispense it out of one little pipe, out of the back of a huge lorry. So you've got huge amounts of people queuing and crowding and waiting when there are drones in the area. So
Yeah, yeah.
big white lorry, very easily spotted from the sky. Whereas we had the opposite approach. We try not to have anyone gathered together at all. We installed barrels. They can hold 1,000 liters. Sometimes we put up to 3 barrels in one location, depending on how many people were there. And we'd arrive, we'd fill it with water, and we'd go. We'd be in and out in, call it between 10 minutes and 20 minutes, depending on the number of barrels that were
So no
there.
messing around, no drama, just in, out, nice and
Because
simple.
people could come exactly where they needed to. If there was shelling, they didn't have to miss a water lorry. They could stay at home and be safe and come out when they felt comfortable. It meant that
Yeah,
people were coming at all different times, so you didn't get congregations of people.
yeah,
It meant that people could take as much as they needed. It meant also they could do it at their convenience. A lot of elderly people that have been left behind. A lot of people taking their kids out. The older people, they don't want to go, or they're not very mobile. It's hot here in summer. It's really hot. You have elderly people coming with a 6 liter plastic bottle, filling it up from a barrel, and then carrying that home. Do you want them to be standing there in a queue in the heat for an hour before they're
yeah.
doing it's the humanity of it. It's such a basic thing. And it was awful that day after Novakakovka because people were terrified. People were in tears when we turned up. They were panic filling. For the first time ever, we had a child thank us for water. That should never happen. We normally have kids run up and say, "Oh, and you're British," and just laughing around and just being kids. That kid was scared because he didn't have water. It was anyway.
But
So
you
that
said the
was
day after Nova Kakovka. Can you just say what that is?
so the Nova Kakovka Dam was, well, it was a brilliant, very dark tactic of the Russians, if one can call it that. The dam was further up the Dnieper River from Kherson,
Mhm.
and apparently, I cannot say this is verified, but apparently the Russians actually built up the water on the reservoir on the north side of the dam before blowing it. They did it, for many reasons, of course, counteroffensive, trying to stop Ukrainian advances. But it was also a very effective terror technique. And the Russians did not help civilians or indeed soldiers on the other side of the Dnieper River who got caught in the flooding. There were a lot of Russian soldier bodies in the Dnieper, which also contributed to the poisoning of the water.
Yeah.
They didn't get help, they just got. And so the amount of flooding, and the thing is, the drinking water in Kherson used to be incredibly good. They actually supplied Mykolaiv because their water was so good. Mykolaiv is having to put its water from the river. The water in Mykolaiv is practically poisonous, because it all used to come from Kherson.
That's their only source now.
Uh,
Yeah.
so the fact that all of this water was contaminated, overnight, there were fears of a cholera outbreak. I mean, we will never know the answer to this, but we don't know for sure that if we hadn't been working in that area and getting water in, if there would not have been some form of cholera breakout, because we know that the wells there were testing positive for it.
Okay, that's quite a good measure of
So if
impact.
people wouldn't have had any other, we'll
Um,
never know. We'll never know for sure.
but you've
So
been linked.
anyway, these that wrapped up in September. We gave the villagers equipment so they could collect their own water. So they weren't reliant on us. They weren't reliant on anybody but themselves. They could collect water. We found central water sources, and we were that was a really nice thing, because usually charities will do stints. They'll say, we'll deliver water to this place for 3 months and then we're out and it's a you problem now. We wanted them to be able to get their own water for as long as they needed, until, God willing, their water infrastructure is repaired, which is happening for some of them now. So we did that for about 30 villages. And Kherson City, we handed off to the water administration for them to, because it's a very high populous urban area. So that was needed there. So in September, we started rebuilding. And this was actually something that we wanted to do before Nova Kakovka. The day before the Nova Kakovka dam was hit, we went to a particular village, which for security reasons I will not name. And it was the only village we've ever been to where every single person was killed or fled. There were 300 people there before the invasion. And the Russians used it to make propaganda videos, raising it to the ground, firing from artillery and helicopters and rockets. And we've been in Ukraine for a while now. We've been to Bucha, we've been to Irpin, we've been to Bakhmut and Lysychansk, and we have seen places that are bad. And we keep thinking we've seen the worst. This village was the worst we've seen.
And
It was just another level. I can safely say the only feeling I've ever had, the same as when I went to this village, was when I went to Auschwitz. And it was like a ghost town. You get there, every building is decimated. It is utterly quiet.
that's quite a long way from the experience you described as you're driving over the Polish-Ukrainian border.
Mm.
all that time ago. And you're saying that the building's being decimated. Your work now then
Mm.
is
Yeah, so
focused on undecimating them. Um,
yeah, we're rebuilding homes. And you know, again, a huge mantra of ours is to fill in the gaps. What are the big charities not doing? And the places we've been helping are where the big charities are not there. They're not. They're not. They essentially see it as too destroyed. And so these people were just left, and people came back. 10 people had returned by the time we got there in June. We were going to help them then. Then Novikov happened. We had to do the water because it was so many more people. So we had to make that really hard choice, but it had to be done. But as soon as we wrapped up the water project, we went back to this place in September, and we've been rebuilding ever since. So of the 10 families that are there at the moment, we've either finished or are not too far off finishing the work on their home. And now we're making plans to do more. We know the village incredibly well now. We know every family that's there, and we've got in touch with the families who want to come back. They'll be renting somewhere else nearby, but they might, a lot of them are in huge financial difficulties as a result of having to rent, and they have no income, they have no property, they have nothing. So we're prioritizing homes for the families that want to come back, the people who might employ other people in the village, try and get some economy going. We're also planning to rebuild the school building, not just as a school, but also as a community center, because at the moment there's no central point where people can.
Nothing.
Yeah, if people will have a village meeting at the moment, they stand on the street in the cold, and it's cold at the moment, and there's snow and there's ice, and some of them are not young. If humanitarian aid gets delivered, it has to be delivered onto the street and put under a tarpaulin. For some people, there's no of them just to meet and talk. There are at least two families where they are the only family on that street. There's no one there, so they have to walk to even have a conversation with someone. So we really want to create that central place for community. They can cook together, they can celebrate holidays together, and yes, also for the children, because at the moment the vast majority of children are having to study online. You
Yeah.
can't do that if you don't have a place to do it with a good internet connection. So we got a Starlink. We have got it. We want to restore this place so that children can study there, and also that children can play there, create a positive space. With all this devastation around them, I want to create at least one proper room for the little kids that is just got a really soft plushy carpet and toys and books, and somewhere that just is safe and normal and warm and comforting, where they don't have to look at bombed out buildings.
Can I ask you one last question then, which is from the UK, the kind of support that you have, you don't fundraise really, but what's the best kind of support that you can have from here?
Well, that's very kind of you to ask. I mean, no, we don't do any public fundraising. We never have. Partially for security. We have never wanted to be in the public eye. Also, just culturally, there are people who unfortunately do come out to Ukraine for some slightly more dubious reasons, and we don't want to be a part of that.
I mean,
So
people that want to come and do helpful charity stuff, but are actually in the way and they're only there so they can boost their social media.
yes, people who appreciate a bit of glory and external validation,
Okay.
and that sort of dynamic. Unfortunately, there is a lot of that in Ukraine. I'm sad to say it, but it's true.
Mm.
Conflict zones do tend to attract a lot of uh, slightly less healthy characters, shall we say? But um, one thing I will say on that is that that there is obviously it's easier to look at the work foreigners do, but people shouldn't for a minute be under the impression that it isn't the Ukrainians doing 90% of all of it. And they are just amazing. And the people that we've been so lucky to work alongside and with, and we got to know some people in the villages we're delivering water to, and we gave them building materials. There were 7 of them and a baby living in 2 tiny rooms. The house next door had been burned down by white phosphorus, which is a war
White
crime.
phosphorus.
Yeah. Oh yes, there's plenty of that. Yeah. Yes. War crimes are abundant in this area, unfortunately. And we gave them building materials to rebuild their home, and we saw that they were good at building, so we hired them. So they work with us now. And we also want to hire people from the village that we are rebuilding. Again, bring some economy in, because the whole dynamic in the village has totally changed since we've been working there. There's a sense of positivity and hope now and optimism. And so, I mean, to anyone who wants to support Ukraine, I guess I would say 2 things. One, it is very important that people recognize that Ukraine is fighting not just for Ukraine, but for all of Europe. And that if Ukraine had fallen, no one can kid themselves that Russia would have stopped there and they would not have kept going. Ukraine is leading for the rest of us. And it is very important to keep supporting them, keep the military aid coming. The air defense, a lot of civilians are going to die if air defense doesn't come out here. We experience it ourselves. If the amount of air defense goes down, we hear more things here. In a more practical sense, find whatever area is close to your heart and go with that. If it is getting medical supplies in to frontline paramedic teams or soldiers, do it. Just get them in. Everyone can do more than they think they can. I never expected to be out here for so long. If you want to, do a fundraiser in your local community and raise money for education materials for children. And the other thing I would say is that it's cheaper to buy things in Ukraine. Raise money, find someone in Ukraine you trust, get them to buy it out here and get them to deliver it. Because you'll have a much higher impact for any funds you raise. It also means you don't have to go through customs, which there are customs things in place now. It's not the same as when I first drove in with a car full of sleeping bags. You do have to have some paperwork now. Not to say it can't be done, but there are some steps that need to be taken. Or look at places that are being rebuilt. There is a lot of rebuilding happening across the country. We have to help Ukraine regenerate, create a future, and not just be decimated for the next 20 years. The amount of mines in the south are absolutely horrendous. I know someone, a very good friend of ours, her brother, who survived Russians pushing through the village, dropping white phosphorus, shelling for months, you name it. He survived that along with all these other people that we know, and then since then he was walking somewhere and he had the whole back of his heel and calf blown off by a mine. I've seen the burnt out carcass of a car where some parents and their 2 little girls were blown up because they hit an tank mine when they were trying to flee the Russians.
And this is still live. This is still something that's a danger.
You can see the car wreckage. You can see children's shoes strewn about on the grass, and these families' clothes and belongings scattered all around the car, up in the trees. It's all still there.
And that's the region that you're working in now.
Yeah.
These remain live dangers today.
Yeah, that's one of the villages where we've been doing rebuild work. Yeah, it's all still very raw here. And even though the area that we're working in was liberated in autumn 22, because it's a question we get asked a lot. Why are you rebuilding when places are just going to get hit again?
Mm-hmm.
And it's not being hit. It's well over a year now since any of these places were shelled. You get the odd Russian drone flying over. That's it.
Right.
These places are not being hit, and these people need homes. They are desperate to come home. The reason that we focused on this village, that was the one I talked about earlier, that was so heavily destroyed, was that we met a retired couple, a really lovely couple. They've had their children, they've had their grandchildren, they've got their little home, they just want to live in peace. And then this happens. They flee to Spain because one of their children is there. They stay there for a year, but they want to come home and they don't want to be a financial drain on their child. So they decide to come back. And we met them 2 days later, and they were utterly in shock. There was nothing left. Their home is rubble. They were sleeping on 2 camp beds in their yard, no shelter, in their 60s. He had already had a stroke this year. She was terrified that he was going to have another one because he was trying to start clearing the rubble of the house. So theirs is one of the first houses that we have rebuilt. These are the sorts of people that need their homes back.
That's really powerful. You have a GoFundMe page. You're happy if I put the link to that up? Okay. Elizabeth from British Expeditionary Agent Rescue, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you.